Hello everybody, I'm Rebecca Fay, the Chief Marketing Officer at Natural Capital Partners. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar today, and I also hope all our US attendees had a very happy Thanksgiving. I'm delighted today to hand over to our Managing Director, Jonathan Shopley, who's a seasoned participant in the annual global climate change negotiations known as COP. He's going to spend the next 30 minutes or so talking about what happened during the COP in Marrakesh earlier this month and what that means for business. That will leave us with plenty of time for questions, so please use the panel on the right-hand side of your screen to submit anything you'd like to ask. And with that, over to you, Jonathan.
I am going to cover the road to Marrakesh, what happened, why we were there, what happens next, and the implications for business. Good. Now, what often happens when we have these annual COPs is everybody gets very focused on what happens in the meeting and during those heady 2 weeks. But I wanted to start this afternoon's exploration of the impact of Marrakesh on business by just taking a wider perspective. And you may have seen this graph before if you've attended one of our previous webinars. I rather like it. It's the graph that shows the Kondratiev cycles, the Russian economist who believed that market-based systems go through about 50-year cycles of boom, depression and regeneration, and that each of these cycles is driven by some kind of technological innovation that disrupts. And if you look at these, the periods that have been identified with the Kondratiev cycles of the steam engine, the age of steam engine, railway and steel, electrification, chemicals, automobiles, petrochemicals, and of course we're in the information technology, communications technology phase now. And I think you probably would all agree that we're going through a fairly disruptive time. We are seeing new clean technologies that are likely to disrupt our current fossil fuel based economy as they get cheaper and more widely dispersed. So we're right on the brink of perhaps Kondratiev's sixth cycle. And by the way, the graph just shows the returns on stock market as a proxy for this sort of boom and bust cycle. So then what I'm going to do now is just put over those Kondratiev cycles a couple of key milestones in climate change. So Arrhenius was the Scandinavian scientist who discovered global warming back in 1890. And when he did, he claimed that there was going to be some gradual build-up in carbon dioxide concentrations, and that might warm the climate, but it would take thousands of years. But of course he'd say that because he was sort of right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution when our use of fossil fuels was just ramping up. So fast forward then to 1990, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced its first report and showed that in fact climate change and CO2 concentrations were really moving apace. And by 1992, the UN had set up the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the organizing body under which all these COPs, Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, happen once a year. And that's what the Marrakesh meeting was all about. And their first action under the UN Framework Convention was to set up the Kyoto Protocol, which was adopted in 2005 and actually began in 2008 and ran out of puff actually in 2012. But because the COP in Copenhagen couldn't really agree a successor to that, it was extended to 2020. And then, of course, what we have is the Paris Agreement in 2015, which finally set up an ongoing replacement to the Kyoto Protocol, one that wouldn't come to an end, but continues in 5-year cycle. And I'll speak more about that in a moment. And then one final thing to say before we leave the Kondratiev boom and bust cycles is that we are often, it's often described this last 150 years as the age of the rise of the Anthropocene age. Up until this time, over literally millions and millions of eons of time, the evolution of Homo sapiens has been driven really by geological changes. And over this period of time, our influence over our environment has dominated. And in fact, it's now felt that our changes to biodiversity or impacts on biodiversity, on climate, are really leading the evolution of Homo sapiens into the next phase. So, with that behind us, let's take a sort of slightly narrower position. So, over the last year, we've had tremendous progress actually on climate policy. Of course, we agreed the Paris Agreement in December, and that could only come into force when 55 countries representing at least 55% of global emissions had signed and ratified that agreement. And that happened, if you look at the last bullet point, on November the 4th, 2016, which was years ahead of when people thought it would happen. So rather took the Marrakesh meeting by surprise. It was going to be a rather boring, very procedural meeting dealing with the Kyoto Protocol. Suddenly now it had to deal with the Paris Agreement because it had been ratified in November, 3 days before the Marrakesh COP. But along the way, we also had the ICAO, the International Airline Aviation Industry's commitment to carbon neutral growth from 2020. Now, one thing about the UN Framework Convention is that it deals with parties, is the language, which means countries and country governments. And sectors like aviation and maritime don't belong to a particular party. So it was outside of the UN framework. Everybody's getting rather anxious about that. But they've come in and they want to participate in some of the constructs of the Paris Agreement. And then in October 15th, the Montreal Protocol, which dealt with ozone depleting gases, included HFCs in its phase-out provisions, because HFCs were a replacement to some of the ozone destroying gases, but also turned out to have very high global warming potential. So the fact that they're being phased out, some scientists believe will actually help us keep temperatures down by about 0.5 degree centigrade. So major progress along the way. And when things began on November the 7th, Monday, November the 7th in Marrakesh, everybody was sort of looking forward to making great progress. And it wasn't Marrakesh's first COP, actually. It has a reputation for getting work done, because 15 years ago at COP7, after the Kyoto Protocol was agreed, everybody met in Marrakesh to develop the Marrakesh Accords, which was really the rule book that translated the Kyoto Protocol into an implementable policy platform. So this was seen as another procedural COP where work would begin on translating the Paris Agreement, which is about a 31-page document at very high level, into a similar kind of playbook or rule book. So Marrakesh, because we had that early entry into force, this was the first meeting of the CMA, which is another way of saying everything under the Paris Agreement. But it also included a little bit of work on the side to keep the Kyoto Protocol going until 2020, which it has to do, sort of holding the fort, as it were, until Paris comes into force. And I'll sort of, I'll give you the final result of Marrakesh, which is there was a commitment to really spend the next 2 years developing the procedures behind the rule book. That's really the major progress that was made. But during the COP, all of that updraft, that following wind that we had in the previous year sort of increased, because by the end of the COP, 122 out of the 193 possible countries that signed up ratified the Paris Agreement, and that represents not 55%, but 79% of global emissions. So there's really a lot of support building for this initiative. And then Wednesday morning was the earthquake, and I'm sure it's unavoidable to say that the results of the US election were surprising and had caused some concern because President-elect Trump had made it very clear that he wasn't a great supporter of the Paris Agreement. In fact, had talked during the campaign of withdrawing the US from that. So this earthquake felt like overnight there'd been a seismic shift in political plates. But the next morning, everybody was sort of looking around for the results of that, and also, as with an earthquake, what sort of aftershocks we might get. But I have to say that after 2 days, everybody realized that life was going to continue. The buildings or the structures were still standing, and by the Friday, people were really getting on with the business of the COP. But there was a lot of talk about what the potential aftershocks could be. And there are three that most people focused in on. There's the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, or actually the UNFCCC in and of itself, the overarching convention. But if you followed the news recently, there's been a lot of language from Trump, which would have said, well, maybe don't need to go down that road. And I'll talk some more about how that could be in a moment. But I think the major aftershocks could be the reduction in funding, which has kept developing economies in the tent, as it were, in the Paris Agreement. There's a real sense that developing economies will have to give up quite a lot of their development potential unless they get funding from elsewhere. And the US has always been a great funder, a contributor to funds like the Green Climate Fund. And then the third is just a general overall lowering of ambition. The Paris Agreement really built up a crescendo of everybody saying that they wanted to do more, but now if one of the major players pulls out, that might sort of reverse that trend. But if I were to take an optimistic view, and I do, I would say that already we're beginning to see that campaign rhetoric, is very different to the political realities of office. We talked a lot about the Reagan effect, the fact that when Ronald Reagan was elected into office, he was not a great supporter of environmental regulation, but after 2 or 3 years, did some remarkable things, of which one was to sign the Montreal Protocol for the US. And then the China challenge, the sense or the fact that the Chinese sort of said, we're sticking firm. If somebody's looking for a leader on this, we are happy to step into that role. And that sort of competitive challenge, as it were, to the US, I think will possibly be potentially a good thing. But the most important of the 4 points here is the fact that American leadership at state level is at a remarkably advanced stage. And I will pick up an example of that. And certainly at business level, the number of businesses that reconfirmed their pledges to the Paris Agreement during Marrakesh, US businesses, was quite marked. And then the final thing, if none of that persuades you, I just want to point out that although the US withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol under Bush, it is one of the countries that will meet its Kyoto targets, or the ones that it would have had if it stayed in. So work will continue. No matter what. Now, let's get down into the details for a bit. Obviously, Marrakesh was largely in part about our transition from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement, and they're very, very different political instruments, as it were. The Kyoto Protocol runs until 2020. The Paris Agreement picks up in 2021, and unlike the Kyoto Protocol, will continue for as long as the parties agree to let it continue. So this is now the real thing, whereas Kyoto might have been the training wheels. Kyoto was top-down. Countries were mandated to meet targets. And in the Paris Agreement's bottom-up, each country has elected to stipulate its nationally determined contributions, which are their voluntary contributions to reductions. There is no binding commitment to meet those. There is a binding commitment under the Paris Agreement to report progress against the NDCs, against a structure and a framework that will be agreed across all parties so that we can get an aggregated view of how we're all doing. And the feeling behind the Paris Agreement is that once we understand how well we're doing against meeting a target or global emissions that will stabilize temperatures below a 2-degree warming, that all players will adjust and increase their ambition if there is a gap in that performance. And then under the Kyoto Protocol, we had market-based mechanisms as defined by the Clean Development Mechanism and also the lesser-known JI, Joint Implementation Initiative. And in the Paris Agreement, now that all countries have targets, one of the major constructs of the clean development mechanism is gone, which is developed countries using developing countries without targets as mechanisms to create additional reductions that are over and above the mandated areas. So Article 6 in the Paris Agreement talks about market-based mechanisms that will replace the CDM or improve the CDM or apply it into this new world where every country has a target. And it talks about emission mitigation mechanisms, or there's language which talks about not the clean development mechanism but the sustainable development mechanism, and then calls for these mechanisms to result in net gains in reductions, not a sort of a zero net gain. So it lays out a real challenge and a lot of work to be done over the next 2 years to get that into some kind of rule book, as the first Marrakesh COP did. And under the Kyoto Protocol, every country with a target had assigned allocation units to tell them how much they could emit. Under the Paris Agreement, that doesn't really exist, and so there is a new acronym. There are many, but this is one of them, the Internationally Transferable Mitigation Outcomes, which will be some kind of mechanism to help with the bookkeeping on who's doing what towards reducing their emissions. Now, I've already talked a bit about Article 6, and you'll probably hear a lot about it over the next couple of years as it starts to get translated into workable platforms. But it talks about the fact, the well-recognized fact, that cooperative approaches, like we had under the Clean Development Mechanism, are really quite key. And many countries have committed to raising their ambition if the Paris Agreement does create some sort of structure along this line, these lines. And then Articles 6.2 and 5 talks about the need for robust accounting so that we don't double count emissions, and that we have accounts that allow us to compare the progress of different countries. And 6.4 is the one that speaks to emission mitigation mechanisms like the CDM. But in the last moments of putting Article 6 together, there were a number of countries who don't quite believe in market-based approaches. And so 6.8 was put in there and said if countries want to find different ways to develop cooperative approaches that are not market-based, they're very welcome and invited to do so. And an example of that would be Norway's support for forest protection in Indonesia, for example, which isn't related to a market-based mechanism, but is a funding mechanism. So that's a quick run by Article 6. Now, if any of you have been to a COP, you'll know that these Conference of the Parties, there are a whole bunch of delegates, and they tend to wear purple striped name tags. And they are negotiators, they represent parties, and they generally spend most of their time huddled in meeting rooms negotiating various clauses and the like. And then there are a range of observers, business observers, NGOs, and others. And I happen to be part of a business delegation for IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association. And although we were observers, we had a number of events on the side. There's a lot going on the side where the negotiators come out and interact with the observers, get their views on certain tough issues. So it's a very dynamic process. And under Christiana Figueres, who's just stepped down as Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, she was very keen to get much closer collaboration between business and parties, and because it is her belief, and certainly it's ours as well, and certainly IETA's, that the private sector's got a critical role to play, both in the design and the implementation. So just a couple of things that I participated in some way, shape or other, that will give you a flavor of what these kinds of side events are, events on the side. There was a fantastic side event that I was able to, invited to moderate, set up by ACR, the American Carbon Registry, which looked at the contribution of voluntary carbon market, or voluntary action, in mainly the west of the United States, in developing methodologies to account for and to give carbon credits to improved rice growing techniques, for example. That was one of them, that reduce methane emissions from rice fields. That has a huge positive impact on greenhouse gas emissions. And what was so powerful about this, and I mentioned this earlier, that at a state level there's an enormous amount going on. But on my panel I had the US Department of Agriculture, I had ACR, the American Carbon Registry, and somebody from CARB, which is the Air Resources Board of California, that's in charge of the cap trade and offset scheme there. And what they spoke to was a terrific collaboration between the Department of Agriculture helping farmers get ready for a methodology developed by the American Carbon Registry to measure and credit methane reductions, which was then adopted by CARB for the California compliance system. It's a really terrific story. The other panel that I moderated was one which then looked at the voluntary action as a critical role under the Paris Agreement. And as I mentioned earlier, the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, are voluntary commitments. So you could argue that voluntary action in some way, shape or form is going to play a huge role in this. And we were looking at and examining Article 6 and seeing how it would be that new rules under Article 6 will help us continue the critical role played by the CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, and offsetting. And then a panel that I participated in that was hosted by EOS Climate, which had done a lot of work in ozone-depleting substances as a mechanism for reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well. And they looked into the impact of blockchain technology bringing radical transparency into environmental commodities like greenhouse gas emissions reductions, so that they can be tracked right around the world within a global trading system. So that was fascinating. It has been a tradition to have a landscape day within the COPs, and there have been until this COP, and I think they're going to change it now. And it used to be called Forest Day, and it focuses it focuses a lot on emissions from forests and the critical role played by forests acting as a sink. But what sort of really amazed me there was a session on the impact of information technology and a variety of other new technologies on our ability to monitor global ecosystems, not just on a sort of annual basis as we've done with Landsat, but every 5 days. This particular company called Planet, which has hundreds of small satellites that are launched in orbits that create and refresh the picture of the Earth's ecosystems on a 5-day basis, and creating a data set that when we start to analyze this will give us terrific ability to track progress, particularly in the forest sector. And then it was a real pleasure to go to the UNFCCC's Momentum for Change event and listen to Microsoft and Philips talk about their leading initiatives to take their companies carbon neutral through a combination of internal reductions, access to renewable energy, and carbon offsetting, which is something that the UNFCCC has been promoting, climate neutral now, using CDM carbon credits for voluntary action. And then many events where businesses, countries, cities, what they call non-party actors, parties being countries, non-party actors could be a state or a business association, making pledges to zero deforestation, 100% renewable energy, carbon pricing leadership initiative, a range of those, and then also complemented with a range of announcements about new funds that we're going to set up to fund mitigation, adaptation projects around the world during this sort of hiatus that we've got for the next 4 years between the Kyoto Protocol sort of gradually running out of steam and the Paris Agreement then sort of kicking in. And then finally, no COP is complete without some kind of proclamation, some sort of grand scheme. I mean, obviously in Paris it was the Paris Agreement, but in Marrakesh, King Mohammed VI got together with a range of businesses and NGOs and others and developed the Marrakesh Proclamation, which committed everybody at the meeting to a program of action. There was a desire to focus that somewhat on Africa, but it wasn't universally supported. They really said, we needed this to be global, but the Marrakesh Proclamation is what sort of closed out the 2 weeks on the second Friday. Now, what happens next? Now, this particular graph just shows that the various trajectories that we have or scenarios on how we might do towards getting to zero emissions by 2021. 2100. I always get that difficult. So by the end of this century. And, one of the things that was highlighted in many of the meetings in Marrakesh is that work done by United Nations Environment Programme has shown that the aggregated NDCs will not get us on a 2-degree pathway, and there is a desire to get us on a 1.5-degree maximum temperature range pathway. So what happens next is an interactive program that is hoped will get us to the point where the NDCs start to add up to something which looks like the lowest trajectory on this graph. So we had the Marrakesh Action Proclamation at the end of that. At the end of the events, there will be another COP which Fiji will host. It's a small island experiencing the ravages of climate change and rising sea levels. So they're going to host the COP in Bonn with Germany's support. And that will be a lot of work, be another sort of procedural COP, I guess. 2018, the rule book is supposed to be agreed. So that's going to be an important COP. But at the same time, the IPCC, the scientific body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, will report on how well we're doing to limit global warming, average warming to 1.5 degrees to that target. So there'll be a large input of scientific analysis. And then by 2020, it is hoped that all nations will sort of reflect on the science, reflect on progress, and revise their indices by improving their ambition. 2023 is the first formal stocktake under the Paris Agreement, and then every 5 years after that, there will be a review, a national accounting of greenhouse gas emissions, and updates on the science. So that's the program as looking ahead. Now, as I mentioned on my first slide, I think that we are at the beginning of the next Kondratiev cycle, low carbon cycle. Again, some of you might have seen this before. One of the things that one recognizes in the COP is that there are companies there that are disruptors. They are part of the recreators of the next boom, really, as their technologies displace incumbent fossil fuel technologies and make them cheaper and therefore more commercially viable. And so the creative disruptors generally get joined by the progressives, and then we have explorers who understand that there might be various changes, but what we find, and as you'll see in this graph, is that much of their strategic demeanor as we move to the bottom left-hand corner is we have companies that have not heavily invested in the fossil fuel area. There were lots of assets in that space. And therefore the degrees of freedom to move at speed into a low-carbon future is going to be slowed down. So we call them the sea anchors because they're sort of anchored, as it were, in a carbon world. But what we know is that there are quadrillions of capital and IP assets invested in our previous boom cycle, actually 4 or 5 boom cycles, and there are trillions of dollars that are now being developed in the disruptor cycle. And so when we think about the services that we offer, we know that there are companies that are sort of low carbon intensity. They don't have a lot of assets that are tied to the fossil fuel economy, like mining houses or energy companies. So they do have degrees of freedom. And those are the kinds of companies that are making pledges to decarbonize 100% renewable because they've got the degrees of freedom to do that. But the energy companies, there are a number of them who've made their own pledges, calling for a price on carbon, looking for a soft landing into this next cycle rather than a disruptive cycle, and calling for a price on carbon to help them adjust and reshape their assets into the low carbon economy. So one of the things that I felt that the US elections told us is that in that transformation from our last boom cycle or 5 cycles that saw us build quadrillions of assets in the high carbon sector is that in this great future that we face in the next Kondratiev cycle of low carbon biotechnology and all the benefits of these amazing technologies is we can't forget our past. We cannot forget the fact that many people are employed, educated and employed, and have felt proud to be part of some of these high carbon intensity companies. And we really have to bring the entire economy forward. It's okay to say that 1 million jobs will be created in the solar industry, but unless those are jobs that people from the tar sands in Canada and the coal mining industries in West Virginia can participate in, that's not really helping us make this social transition. So my final slide is the fact that the US election did make people feel that a lot of that impetus that we got over the last year had been somehow deflated and that things looked a little uncertain. I think they're less uncertain than people think they are, but clearly many of the businesses say, we hate uncertainty around policy, we need certainty to take progress, but it's not really true. We know that. Businesses never stops taking action if uncertainty poses high opportunities and high risks. And so, at the end of the Marrakesh COP, it seemed to me that there were many, many companies that felt that the direction of travel into the next Kondratiev cycle is clear. We're decarbonizing our economy. The opportunities to participate in that and the solutions that are immediately available to companies to go 100% renewable through power purchase agreements or building their own now are becoming much cheaper assets. The price of solar and wind has dropped 60 to 70% over the last couple of years. So that's immediately available. There are opportunities to set net zero targets for greenhouse gas emissions or science-based targets or some glide path that companies can meet, particularly in scopes 1 and 3 emissions by using offsets, which equally, if they come from projects with high co-benefits, can deliver to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are also a very strong theme in the Marrakesh conversation. We need, whatever we do here, to contribute to sustainable development, not to undermine it. And all of these actions help put a price on carbon, which is what all companies are calling for, to help a softer landing that protects and enhances our social, environmental, and financial capital. So, Rebecca, that is my last slide, and we're going on to questions now, and I hope that a couple may have come through.
Coffee, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan. We certainly have had a couple of questions. I'm going to start with one which I think will be interesting to hear you answer. What is blockchain?
Right, thank you. So blockchain is a form of encryption. It is often conflated with Bitcoin and this new currency where we have an ability now to create a historical record of a transaction of any commodity, whether it be money or a ton of carbon, that tracks all of the information about that and makes it available in a very transparent way. So if you don't know what blockchain is, if you think about Bitcoin, it's the technology that enables Bitcoin. And it's a crypto technology, which means that the information about the commodity is highly protected and very comprehensive. I'll stop there because I could easily run out of technical depth on that one.
Excellent. You've passed that exam question. Well done. So next, one question is, you talked about that at the Paris COP there was a lot of business involvement, and that was very unusual that Christiana Figueres had encouraged that. Was there the same level of business involvement in Marrakesh and the same level of enthusiasm for pledges and statements and actions that was seen in Paris?
So I think that the nature of businesses involvement changed from Christiana Figueres' time, where business was really much literally, physically and psychologically closer to the negotiations. As it happens, the Open for Business Forum that was run by AITA was sort of stuck down an alleyway with the Ugandans. I think it was a mistake. I think Uganda and Haiti got forgotten about, so we had a little sort of tent on the edge. But having said that, there were a couple of other things that were notable. Many of the business observers were wearing purple badges, which means that business has actually been invited onto the negotiating teams of some of these nation states, some of the smaller ones, and actually even the US had a couple of private sector people on the sides, not facing off directly on the negotiation. So I think I took that as a sign that actually business is being actually invited in to participate in the negotiations. In terms of the pledges and the commitments to funding, to priming funds that are going to invest in some of the adaptation and mitigation efforts, there was a lot of reconfirmation of previous things like zero deforestation, the New York Declaration on that, carbon pricing, we mean business, science-based targets. There were a whole bunch of increased in numbers to initiatives that were started back in Paris. So, I think it was very strong. Business involvement was really much strengthened.
Great, thank you. This question is, someone has suggested it's a bit naive, and I want to assure them that no question in this very complex area is ever naive, and it's perfectly reasonable to want a bit of an explanation about how do countries actually account for their greenhouse gas emissions if the private sector and the private citizens don't report that information?
It's definitely not a naive question, and I'd like to say that one of the most vexed issues at all of these COPs is about how we measure, monitor, and compare emissions. But so, without going into too technical a detail, most of our emissions as individuals or businesses come from our use of fossil fuels or other gases that give rise that cause global warming. And so if we know how much electricity a country generates from which fuel mix, if we know what fuels are being used in our transport systems, and we know how much methane gas we have associated with agriculture and agricultural waste or landfills, which you can actually get on a country level, then a country is well able to do its greenhouse gas inventory. And we as consumers are the cause of these emissions, that actually we can find ways on a national level to measure that. Some of the more tricky areas, which is why I mentioned that company Planet that has those satellites that look at forests every 5 days or re-examine forests every 5 days, is that greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture and land use and deforestation are some of the trickiest things to measure. But knowing how much ground cover has been lost in deforestation gives you a reasonable handle on that. But I'll stop there. I'm not getting too technical.
Thank you. Coming back to the comment about President-elect Trump and what that means for the Paris Agreement overall, if the US does exit the agreement, do you have any sense of what you think China will do?
I can tell you what they said they would do. They're going to carry on. They're fully committed. They've talked about implementing a nationwide cap, trade, and offset scheme from 2017 based on 7 pilots that they've been running over the last couple of years. And intriguingly, they've been learning from the EU cap and trade system, from California, from Korea. And one of the things I found interesting is that they said they're not going to adapt any one of the pilots. They're actually going to improve on that. They've found faults with all of their particular systems, and they're going to go national. So they're pretty committed. They have got targets in their NDCs that they have built their next 5-year economic plan on. So there's a sense that they will continue. I don't think they'll waver. I think the countries that are more likely to waver and to lose their appetite for ambition will be the BRIC countries, India, Brazil, South Africa, not excluding China actually, because those are the countries that are expecting finance from the developed world. And if the US does pull out, there will be a sense that finance will not be at the level that has been expected.
Thank you. And a final question, which brings us back firmly in the realm of business action. Um, The creative disruptors, as they are, you described them on your slide, have a lot of capital behind them that enables them to easily achieve their climate targets. But what about the companies that are not as large as a business like Google? Can smaller companies also afford to become carbon neutral or commit to 100% renewable energy in the same way?
Yes, and in a strange way, I'd say that it's actually easier for smaller companies because larger companies have got huge energy footprints. And what that means is that companies like Google, in particular, are sort of having to move out of their core competence, which is information technology and data management, into setting up, owning, building, operating, or at least contracting with large renewable energy infrastructure. Smaller companies have got an opportunity to do very similar things, to commit to 100% renewable energy by using market-based instruments like renewable energy certificates or guarantees of origin. They have abilities to meet science-based targets or net zero by combining the use of those kinds of instruments with carbon offsets. And they can use the pricing of those instruments to help them decide whether they should do an internal reduction that might be cheaper than any of those instruments that they're buying. So I would, and one final thing, by the way, their footprints are so much easier to measure. To measure the footprint of a large multinational organization with offices and sales activities all around the world. Some of the distribution clients, logistic clients, say, we're present in 190 countries around the world. And we've got to measure our footprints there. That gets tough. So the short answer is absolutely. If anything, it would be easier.
I think that's it for all of our questions. So that just leaves me to now say thank you to all of our attendees today. We hope you found this useful and interesting, and we will, of course, be emailing out a recording to everyone, so please do feel free to pass it on to colleagues or other people you feel might be interested, and please contact us. Don't hesitate to contact us if you have any other questions. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time.